Hi, in this video we're going to talk about the essay by Evelyn Fox Keller, Women, Science, and Popular Mythology. The essay I think is fairly easy to understand, but perhaps before or even after you read it, maybe a few definitions might be worth getting a little control of here. The first is perhaps making a distinction between sex and gender. Typically, when we talk about sex, what we're referring to is someone's set of biological characteristics. Here, I think the primary words that we'd use would be things like male, female. It turns out, though, that there are a significant number of people who actually have ambiguous genitalia. And there's a whole history on this. You might want to take a look at it on the internet. There's been books. I think it's all relevant, worth looking at. Gender is a little different, though. Gender is a set of qualities that ends up being taught. It's stuff that we end up learning. And here, the words that we'd probably use would be like masculine and feminine. And there's probably a much wider spectrum. It's probably not nearly as binary as we once thought. Now, typically, based on someone's sex, the social structure of the family would teach a particular gender. But again, gender ends up being, in a very weird way, artificial. It's a story we tell ourselves. The other term here that we want to define is what she means by mythology. The word mythology in this context doesn't mean something that's necessarily false. Instead, I think she's using it in the way the word has its origins. It actually comes from the Greek word mythos. And mythos was a story. It was a story that wasn't necessarily false, but it was a story that was enacted. And it was contrasted to logos. Logos is just a discourse about. Logos is the word that we get at the end of like biology or physiology, right? It's a logos, it's a discourse about. Again, mythos is this narrative, it's a story. So even the story of science, in a weird way, is mythos. In the beginning was a giant bang, right? All right. So we have these things that are these stories, and lo and behold, they're stories we enact. And oftentimes these stories are sort of hidden. That is, we don't actually know we're enacting them. For example, there's a story inherent in money. If you take a look at all the people on money, we put them there because they're people of value. Right, we have Abraham Lincoln, we have Thomas Jefferson, we have Ben Franklin on the 100, all these people that we value. But if you start looking, you'll notice they're all white males, right? And it tells this story, and it's a story about what we value in America, right? Now, people have recognized this, they're trying to change it. I think currently there's a move to try to get Harriet Tubman on the 20. Andrew Jackson was a piece of work, so putting somebody else on that would be preferable in my opinion. Okay, we say so. Gender, right, is this thing that we learn. Mythos is a set of stories. So in a weird way, we can talk about gender mythology, right? We can talk about this story that we heard growing up about who it is we're supposed to be. Her thesis in this essay, Keller's thesis, is, and here she's a great scientist, right? That's her actual background. She's, I think, a molecular biologist, worked at MIT. I think she's currently a professor emeritus at UC Irvine. You can still hear her speak. She's out there on the circuit. But she writes using the scientific method, and the first step in the scientific method is to define a problem. Well, the problem that she decides to focus in on is the low participation rates of women in big research science positions. And this is striking because if we look at the participation rates of women in other fields, with programs like affirmative action and a little bit more insightful hiring practices in general, the participation rates of women has grown tremendously. So for example, if we take a look at police departments across the country, the number of women who are becoming police officers has increased, right? Medical school has been tremendous, right? I think currently the vast majority, right, of people who go into medical school are actually women, and this marks a big change. So we've seen women be more able to pursue careers that they find interest in, that they think they might be good in, but we're not seeing that, she says, in the sciences. Take a look at the PDF I've included, right, because it's the next slide on here. But it shows you where things were, I think, back in 2010, because when she wrote the article, that was some time ago. And what you'll still see is that, like, the big professorships at UCLA, Harvard, Stanford, all these tier 1 schools, we still don't, you know, that there's something going on, right? The participation rates of women are lower. In 2005, there was a conference at Harvard University about this issue, about the participation rates of women in the sciences. And lo and behold, the president of Harvard, who was unpopular at the time for a whole bunch of other reasons, got before a crowd and said, well, by the end of it, maybe we'll see that there's actually a biological reason. Maybe there's something about men's biology that just makes them better at doing that. Now, while that's a thesis, and you might want to consider it, at the time he proposed it, it didn't go over so well. Because again, the thought was, look, it's not biological here, it's probably sociological. There's probably about something going on about the way we raise boys and the way we raise girls that probably contributes to this. Because again, we saw that as the cause in other areas. Okay. So her thesis then is that that problem is the result of what she calls deep cultural forces that continue to alienate women from the sciences. So her claim here is that we have two stories. We have a story about what good science is, and we have a good story about what gender is. And you can take a look at this in the essay. She lays out 8 claims, right? Like, you know, women are supposed to be feeling, good scientists are supposed to be thinkers. So go through that list of 8 things. I think you'll find it meaningful, and I don't think I need to go over it all here. But the result is that as young girls are going through their educational journey, right, and they're learning what it means to be feminine, right, and at the exact same time, they're taking classes that tell them what a good scientist is supposed to be, why, lo and behold, they feel alienated from the practice and they sort of move away, right? They decide to achieve, you know, go after other things. I even have a nice little film, again, after this lecture that you can look at from Verizon that I think describes this really, really nicely in about a, 30-second little ad. So again, take a look at that. All right. So again, the way we raise girls is sort of alienating from certain practices. Well, first of all, I think that's quite a thesis, because I guess I expected when reading her essay that she was going to make the claim that somehow women were being forced out of these positions. There was something keeping them from doing it. But her claim is more insidious, right? I mean, it's provocative. It's not so much that women are being kept out of these fields. Women are self-selecting out of them, but not necessarily of their own free will. They're self-selecting out of these fields because of the gender story that they're hearing about themselves growing up. And again, that's really provocative. Now, this plays special role in science because the inequality or the idea that science is aimed at one particular gender more than the other, it's a bit more masculine than feminine, is a particular problem for science. Because for science to be as effective as possible, we need it to be as objective as possible. We need it to be open to as many perspectives as possible. So if science is currently biased in that it sort of attracts a group of people that have a particular view of the world, kind of a masculine view, and of course it's totally possible for both women and men to have a masculine view of the world. Again, we're talking not about sex here, we're talking about gender. There's nothing, there's nothing contradictory at all with the idea that both men and women reinforce patriarchy, reinforce an understanding of gender that puts one sex as somehow more valuable or more important than the other. And again, I think that's at this point in time what we're trying to unpack as a culture. We're not necessarily going for sameness. What we want is a sort of equality of opportunity. And if there's something in our culture that is purposely alienating young girls from going into the sciences, well, that's bad for those young girls, but it's also bad for science. because again, what we need is for science to be as objective as possible. Okay, her solution, right? Problem, again, is the low participation rates of women in the sciences. Her thesis is that it has to do with, again, the survival of deep cultural forces, mythologies, right? These stories we've been enacting. Her solution then is rather bold. She's like, okay, it's time to just get rid of the gender ideology stuff, right? This idea of masculine and feminine has probably just totally outworn its usefulness. Maybe these stories about our patterns of behavior made sense back when we were in an agrarian society, when people were living on farms and we needed to do this division of labor. But at the point that we are now, well, we've not only gone through the Industrial Revolution, but we've kind of gone through the Technical Revolution as well. The sex differences between men and women don't seem to have anything really to do with the kinds of jobs that they would have, right? So the thesis, this move toward androgyny, this move toward getting rid of gender ideology, again, while a little bit provocative, is this idea that, look, maybe what we should do is rather than raising our kids to be masculine or feminine, maybe what we do is we raise them to be human, right? That again, maybe these old categories just don't make too much sense, right? Cool. We'll stop there on her argument now. Our next theorist, Nestor King, is going to argue for a position called ecofeminism. So I'll have that video up very shortly about that, but she's going to disagree with Keller's proposed solution. She agrees with the problem. She agrees that there's something about science, women, and nature that makes it so that our analysis of technology, our analysis of science, is inseparable from our analysis of gender. I mean, a great point is nature is typically considered feminine. The goal of science is the mastery of nature. So it seems that women have some sort of connection here, something that our gender has some connection to the view that we have of the world. Cool. Thank you. Good luck.